you, all of you. I've been reading and engaging in the comments. Honestly, I think I may have found my little niche. Y'all might be stuck with me for a little while, at least through this Diddy trial. And because there's so many witnesses and important points to break down, I'm going to split this into two parts. This part one and part two will pick up with the rest of the key players and take us deeper into what the prosecution is trying to prove. Now, I want to clear something up. Last week when I did this TikTok, it was kind of a spur-of-the-moment thing. I kind of did a Jay-Z freestyle off the top of the head. So yeah, maybe not everything came out as precise as I would have said it sitting in front of a mic or in a courtroom, but I think the essence of everything was still solid. I talked about whether or not Cassie was the main witness. And you know what? I'll say, yeah, she is. She's definitely the catalyst for all of this. Her lawsuit, along with others that followed, kicked the door open and got the feds looking into Diddy. But the real point I was trying to drive home was this. If all the prosecution had was Cassie's story, there wouldn't be much of a case. Now, I know we talked a little about her testifying first, and some of y'all pointed out that she was pregnant, and that's fair. But again, even that being said, the prosecution doesn't usually start with the strongest parts of their cases. And if you've been watching how this trial has unfolded since Cassie's testimony, you can see what I meant. Cassie's testimony was just one piece of the puzzle. And now one by one, we're seeing additional puzzle pieces fall into place. Witnesses who not only corroborate her parts of her story, but also bring in the details about events she wasn't even present for. And that's how a complex case like this gets built layer by layer. Now, look, before I get into each of the witnesses, I want to break down a little bit how they fit this puzzle. I want to go over again the charges because I think it's important to keep these fresh in your mind throughout the trial. Because this is what the prosecution is aiming to prove with their witnesses. As you hear each witness, think about how their testimony helps check off one or more of these boxes. So what does the government again have to prove? First, they have to prove that an enterprise existed involving Diddy and others. That the enterprise engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity, meaning multiple related criminal acts. And that Diddy had a role in directing, maintaining, or benefiting from that criminal enterprise. And for the sex trafficking charge, they have to show that individual forced, defrauded, or coerced into commercial sex acts. And for transportation for prostitution, I think that's a pretty easy one. Then they just need to show that Diddy knowingly caused someone to be transported across state lines for the purposes of committing sex or participating in sexual acts. So, first witness, Daniel Phillips. He was the escort. He testified that Diddy paid him to sleep with Cassie while Diddy watched and gave instructions. That's a commercial sex act arranged and controlled by Diddy. It supports trafficking, and it builds the idea of Diddy orchestrating others, which is key to RICO. Carrie Morgan, Cassie's former best friend. She said Cassie feared losing her career if she left, and she saw Diddy assault her multiple times. She also received a $30,000 hush payment and was made to sign an NDA. And I think Carrie has been clear that she's no longer friends with Cassie, is not filing a civil suit against Diddy, which makes her one of the best corroborating witnesses we have and most credible. That's not just abuse that she saw, but that she saw control and cover-up. It supports both trafficking and the RICO charge. Dawn Richards, she said she saw Diddy beat Cassie with a skillet and heard him say we could go missing. That, again, is coercion and supports the RICO. George Kaplan, the former assistant. He prepped rooms for freak-off, he delivered drugs, and he saw Cassie with a black eye. Kaplan even was interesting because he was granted immunity to testify after initially telling the man in courts that he was going to invoke the Fifth Amendment. He also testified that he used a corporate credit card to pay for some of the setups and the items involved in these encounters. That ties the financial resources of the Bad Boy enterprise directly to the alleged criminal conduct. Bad Boy wasn't just a music label. It helped facilitate and fund what the government says were acts of trafficking and coercion. David James, the other assistant, he walked in on Cassie unconscious and was instructed to prep rooms of baby oil and lube. That's logistical support for sex acts, which builds towards a structured RICO charge. Cherie Hayes, the Punisher, the other escort, probably the most famous one, he said he was paid by Diddy and Cassie to participate in sex acts. And what stood out was that Cassie was actually looking at Diddy for permission while they were performing these acts. That shows the control which supports sex trafficking and Diddy's leadership in this RICO scheme. What key is he also testified that he traveled across city lines into New York and Los Angeles, which goes directly to transportation for prostitution charges. So that's part one. Part two, we're going to pick up with Kid Cudi. If you haven't watched part one yet, go check that out. I already broke down what Daniel Phillip, Carrie Morgan, Dawn Richard, George Kaplan, David James, and Cherie Hayes brought to the table. Now, in part two, we're going to dive into the next round of witnesses. Each one either adds something to what Cassie said or adds a new layer to the prosecution's bigger picture, whether it's about control, intimidation, or how the whole operation was set up. So let's talk about the most famous one, obviously. Kid Cudi. Cudi testified that after he and Cassie started dating, his Porsche got firebombed, and there was an incident where his house got broken into. He said that when he later met with Diddy, Diddy was standing in the window looking like a Marvel supervillain. Now listen, he never specifically said, Diddy did it. He never had that smoking gun. So he wasn't really the slam dunk I think most of us thought he was going to be. But what he did do was back up what Cassie said, how she warned him about retaliation, and what happened. Boom, retaliation. So even if he didn't point the finger, his story lines up with hers. It shows that the fear Cassie had was real. And that's part of how the prosecution shows coercion and violence, which is central to both RICO and sex trafficking. Hopefully later on there'll be a witness who actually threw the Molotov cocktail or broke into the house with Diddy. So next up was Cassie's mom, Regina Ventura. She testified that Diddy demanded $20,000 and threatened to leak 6 tapes of her daughter if she didn't pay. She even took out a home equity loan. The money was eventually returned to her, but the threat, that stuck. That's not just tension between family members. That's real psychological pressure used to control not just Cassie, but the people around her. And that goes straight to coercion. That's the kind of emotional leverage that supports the prosecution's claim of how Diddy maintained dominance over everybody. And then there was the Homeland Security agent, Gerard Gannon. He testified about what was found during those raids on Diddy's home. There was drugs, guns, bottles of lube, baby oil, high heels, surveillance gear, and all of it paints a picture of not only a guy having wild weekends, but of someone running an operation. It wasn't just chaos, it was control. The feds are saying that these weren't just party favors, they were tools, and that kind of organized setup, that helps support the enterprise structure that the prosecution needs to prove under RICO in transportation for prostitution. Then we had Dr. Dawn Hughes. I think she's really big for Cassie. She's the trauma expert. She came in and she walked the jury through trauma bonding, how victims can become emotionally tied to abusers, why they stay, why they don't report right away, and why they sometimes even go back. She basically explained how someone like Cassie could appear willing, but still be under intense psychological control. And that's key, because when you're talking about federal sex trafficking charges, coercion isn't just physical, it's mental and emotional. And Dr. Hughes helped put words to what Cassie lived through. There was Miss Morales, Cassie's former makeup artist. Miss Morales says she saw Cassie with swollen eye, busted lip, and head lumps after an argument with Diddy. She didn't go to the hospital. She didn't tell anyone. She just kept going. And that might seem small, right? But it's not. That's the physical proof that backs up Cassie's story about violence. And it shows that even when harm was done, there was silence. That supports the idea of an environment where people were scared, conditioned, or manipulated into keeping quiet. That's more fuel for the prosecution's coercion and pattern of control argument. There was the hotel security guard, Israeli Flores. He described an incident in 2006 where Diddy was allegedly blocking Cassie from leaving the hotel after the video that we all saw. And then he tried to pay him off afterwards, and he refused. That's a classic combo of force and hush money. You try to trap someone and then silence the witness, and when you hear that same pattern from multiple people, it gets harder to dismiss the kind of control tactic that fits the prosecution's narrative about how Diddy maintained the machinery of what they're calling a criminal enterprise. And then there was the other hotel executive, Mr. Frederick Zamora. He talked about how Diddy would book rooms under fake names like Frank White, and that those rooms regularly needed extra cleaning, wax on the walls, oils everywhere, the whole nine. Diddy have them pay extra fees after he checked out. Now, one messy hotel room isn't really illegal, but when it keeps happening across different cities and it matches what other witnesses described as freak-off setups, that builds the idea of a pattern. Something repeated, something arranged, and that's exactly what prosecutors need to show for RICO and for proving that people were moved in use of commercial sex, which ties directly into transportation for prostitution and sex trafficking. So eventually we get that big picture. And then, now I want to pause a little bit for a second and get some perspective for myself. There's a quote I've heard a lot during this trial from Oscar Wilde. Everything in the world is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. And that kind of feels true here. This just isn't about Diddy being sexually deviant. Look at others like R. Kelly, Weinstein, and even Cosby. A lot of these powerful men likely fulfilled every sexual fantasy possible and got bored. And after that, it's not just about pleasure. It becomes about dominance, control, and power. When you get fame, money, and influence, you can make people do whatever you want. Things they never thought they would do sometimes without laying a hand on them, just by being who you are. You become that pressure, and that's what this case seems to show. Not just a man who partied wild, but a man who used his power to bend others to his will. So while some people are still focused on Cassie saying that this is really a domestic violence case, the truth is she was just the start. Every witness after her helps build the prosecution's case piece by piece. Some are stronger than others, and some of them, be honest, could have been charged too. But maybe they flipped, maybe they cut deals. We will never really know. But the trial isn't over and more pieces are coming. So don't rush to a verdict. Watch how it builds, because that's the fun of when you're doing cases, is watching the building moments. In the next few TikToks, I'm going to dive deeper into questions a lot of you keep on asking, like, can the government go after Diddy's kids, trust fund? Why is only Diddy being charged if RICO usually involves multiple people? Can backbone money be seized? Why aren't some of these witnesses being charged if they clearly helped enable what happened? I'm also going to address some other things. The idea that this is just a witch hunt against a black man. I hear that. And I'll break down how similar prosecution cases for RICO happened in the FIFA case, the Nexum, and other cases had nothing to do with race. And finally, some people have asked, how can I be a criminal defense attorney and speak on this without sounding like I'm siding with the prosecution? And that's never a thing. I'm going to answer that because this isn't about picking sides. It's about calling out abuse, right? Wherever it exists, and breaking down how the law works when it does. So yeah, I've got more coming. Stay tuned. I love all your questions, so please keep them coming, and I'll try my best to answer them as much as possible.